So major changes have happened, certainly in the archaeological record, since 2008 when I put together my part of the project. Listening to the exciting things that Ed's talking about, I was thinking again about some of my presentations. It's a little bit of a downer, but I think a worthwhile series of caveats need to be discussed for the archaeological data sets. And so I'm going to get that stuff over with first. For a recent article I was doing on Athabascan prehistory and basically Western Subarctic prehistory, I ran across a great quote from Knut Pladmark in 1979 when he reviewed the 1977 Athabascan question book that many of us are familiar with. He said the Athabascan area seems particularly prone to a tendency for researchers to search for and surprisingly find ancestors of historic ethno-linguistic groups in millennia-old lithic industries. He went on to say that this paradigm does not permit our evaluation of groups that appeared, diverged, or disappeared. In the world of high-latitude foragers, local extinctions, amalgamations must always be considered as possible scenarios that could obfuscate long-range linkages. So I just put that forward as, it's enticing to try to find the ancestors of all the groups that we know of today, but we should keep in mind with low population densities on the landscape, low carrying capacities, and just a very difficult place to make a living, there's always that possibility that we have groups that we haven't accounted for that simply don't exist. So lineage extinction should be considered. So what can archaeologists provide to address the Dene-Yenisian question? What are our limitations? The prospect of attempting to link ancient languages or proto-languages with material culture is daunting, if not impossible. A large number of proposed linkages may be consistent with the data, and that's the thing I want to one of the main points I want to make, that we can make the archaeological data fit a broad range of scenarios, but not impossible. So some positive elements. In the absence of writing, we can only offer support and tentative support of that for any linguistic hypothesis, and for most situations we can't really provide robust tests between hypotheses. We don't have proper ethnographic analogs for most periods in prehistory. We don't know how permeable material cultural boundaries are, and this one assumption can change the rules of the game. If these material cultural boundaries are permeable, then anything is possible. People could be moving in between these material cultural units that we look at. However, we do have positive things. We have high resolution control of chronology, of peopling events, migration, diffusion of material culture. We have discovered clusters of traits that do in fact represent ancient peoples. They did exist. They're not hypothetical, but they exist in fact in specific areas and specific times, interacting with their environment and with their neighbors in specific ways. And they did speak a language, even if we can't directly attest what that language was. And I want to contrast archaeological and genetic data, ancient genetic data. For the latter, we're entirely dependent upon incredibly small samples, which are sparse in time and space. We can witness this problem with the changing ideas about Neanderthal and modern human interbreeding. At first, a few years back, absolutely never, 0%. Now we're up to maybe 4% of our genes are shared. We have a total ignorance of the Denisovan population, an entirely different subset of humans. Had no idea until we got a sample that indicated that. So I think we should keep that in mind, that archaeology can provide a much more robust sample data set to look at these ancient questions. Even with these issues, however, I'm extremely excited about Ed Vida's work and the work that has been done by others on this hypothesis. It's incredibly important. If the Dene-Yenisieian link is established, it can provide an incredibly strong avenue for interpreting and explaining the archaeological record of the Western Subarctic, and of course play an important role in understanding the colonization of the New World. In brief, we have two primary means of explanation in archaeology. For most ancient contexts, we don't have ethnographic or linguistic correlates. We use general analogy. It's derived from basic assumptions about hunter-gatherer behaviors, optimal foraging, simple physics-related middle-range theory, linking dynamic processes we observe in the present with static material remains that we also observe in the present, but that's very limited. It's not ethnographically informed. It's very system-oriented, it's very function-oriented, change is very difficult to evaluate, and it tends to be of the black box kind. Culture happened, something happened, and this is the result that we see. Another problem is that if we assume culture is our extrasomatic means of adaptation, then every response, every strategy could be considered adaptation. There's no test for it. So we have our answers in a circular sort of a way. So if you look long enough, because the data is so coarse-grained, you will find a correlate with climate, with vegetation change, with some other aspect that may or may not actually be important. The second approach is more limited. It's termed the direct historical approach. We can only use it if we can identify sufficient historical connections between an ethnographically known group and a closely related prehistoric group. This can be an incredibly powerful holistic tool. For instance, Ainu data have been used to understand ancient Jomon settlement structure in northern Japan, down to the types of activities and social organizations occurring between houses with no archaeological data to indicate what actually happened. Ethnographically informed models are much more realistic and much more compelling if they can be applied. So we come to the Dene-Yenisian question. One of the problems we've always had is that the Athabascan record and some of the materials you see here, Thrall, which in summer camp, and Denied Fish Camp, relatively ephemeral sorts of archaeological remains, really could only be pushed back to 1,000 years ago. That was always the problem. So you had these two approaches. You had a very well connected, ethnographically informed modeling for recent past, but then the previous past, let's look at hunters in Europe, let's look at actualistic studies. It was disconnected. First, we know we have evidence in this region. Most of the time I'm going to be talking about the Western Subarctic for incredibly, wow, it's kind of cut off. So I'm sorry if some of my material is cut off on either side. But we have incredibly conservative technology. This material could be 2,000 years old. It could be 14,000 years old. This is actually 2,000 years old, microblade technology. This could be a few hundred years old, or it could be 10,000 years old. This happens to be 10,000 years old. So that conservative nature of technology in this region is incredibly important, and I think an incredibly interesting anthropological problem that does relate to the Dene-Yenisian hypothesis. So we have some new data. First, since the publication of the book, we discovered the first residential structure at Hassanah, or Upper Sun River, dated to 11,500 years ago. Associated with it is a child cremation. DNA from this child, and fingers are crossed, will provide substantial information about the populations in Beringia and potential tests for the Dene-Yenisian hypothesis in terms of ancient connections and timing. Faunal remains were identical to later Holocene diets, primarily salmon, hare, ground squirrel, and birds. No mammoth here. All the evidence, and this is connected with sites like Broken Mammoth that Dave and other folks have worked on, is showing a very different picture than our idea of these specialized big game hunters that came over. This looks very Athabascan in terms of the way in which they're operating on the landscape. All evidence indicates this is a residential base camp of a local foraging group. In 2005 and later, Wilson, Razik, and Ackerman have shown that caribou drives and communal hunting was present in the Northern Archaic 5,000 years ago. At Agiak Lake, there's possible evidence for aggregations of perhaps 50 individuals associated with the caribou drive. This is an Athabascan type behavior. My intersite analyses have shown increasing use of lake shores and riverbanks, more logistical behavior during the Northern Archaic. And this is maybe news to some of you. We have discovered the earliest cache pit in the region at Mead just last year. This is dated to 4,100 years old. You can see how deep it was dug. No evidence at all from the surface. Athabascan cache pits in recent times, of course you can see them on the surface, they were less than 1,000 years old. Birch bark at the very bottom of this was associated. So, first evidence of storage, and it goes back into the Northern Archaic. So I think we're seeing an emerging pattern here. All of these lines of evidence can be then looked at for what we thought we knew in 2005. And that's that, we should treat the Northern Archaic and Denali and these earlier populations as something different. They're quite distinct from Athabascans, right? Within Athabascan, the last 1,000 years, you've got residential base camps, you've got widespread food sharing, you've got cache pits, caribou fences, communal hunting, all of this. And what do we see earlier? Well, ephemeral hunting camps of some kind, high mobility, et cetera, et cetera. This is what we have now. So we know that those aren't necessarily just ephemeral hunting camps. Now we can contrast, at least in this earlier record, and sample size is a problem, certainly. But there's no reason to suspect we don't have this kind of system operating the entire way. We have food sharing at Gersel River and other sites. We have cache pits, caribou fences, communal hunting, all the way to the Northern Archaic. It suggests some anthropological interesting arguments about resource stress and changes through time. But the point here is not that these are Na-Dene peoples. The point is that system can be used. The ethnographic data can be used to better model what's happening in the early prehistory. And I think from my perspective, there's absolutely no reason why, at least the Northern Archaic, the last 6,000 years, we've got extremely large amounts of evidence for continuity. Interesting things are happening 1,000 years ago, but the Athabascan record is clearly going beyond that. So let's take a closer look at the archaeological data as they relate to the Dene-Yenisian hypothesis. I think I'm not there yet. So in 2008, I focused on three main areas: patterns of material-cultural continuity and discontinuity, identifying contemporaneous archaeological groups with distinct and separate material-cultural traditions, and then evaluating antiquity of language groups from the present using the direct historical approach. And I'm happy to say that my work, that of Don DeMond, Jack Ives, and Mike Fortescue, yielded 4 entirely different conclusions in the book. I think that's a good thing. We have a rich and fertile ground for hypothesis generation. And again, the more hypotheses, the better. Then we can start testing and weeding out the ones that meet or that can be refuted based on the evidence. But we do have some points of agreement. There's evidence for migration at certain points of discontinuity in the record, and this is broadly across Northeast Asia and Northwest North America, between 14 and 12,000 years ago, a period between 6,000 and 4,800, and then at 1,000 years ago. These are time periods of instability. Things are changing, radically on the coast, in the interior, at many places at these time periods. In between, it looks like stasis, more stasis. Second, specific material cultural correlates with Na-Dene speakers are equivocal at best. Microblades possibly have been bandied about, but it's way too wide of a distribution, certainly on the Asian side. But possibly we could argue it perhaps in Northwest North America. There are issues with DNA at Honornee's Cave that maybe we can talk about later. Kavik points, those thin, very small stem points, they're not present in all Athabascan contexts, so that can't be used as a correlate. It's just a subset. Matson and Magny in 2008 developed a projectile point stylistic variability argument looking at Salishan versus Athabascan point styles. By and large, it seems to work. So I think that is a development when you look at a broader range of data sets, and they had a pretty large data set. Some correlates could be derived, but that doesn't include Tlingit, doesn't include Eyak, it's just Athabascan. I found that several researchers posit local continuity of specific language groups that extend beyond the 2,000, 3,000 year range. So just going through a couple of them. So Shield Archaic Woodland, Wright is arguing these are Algonquian speakers. Nessiket in the British Columbia area is a disconnect. Then the Plateau Pit House tradition, which dates to 5700, has been argued to be associated with Salishan speakers. Locarno Beach, Marpole phase in the northwest coast have been argued to be Salishan from at least 3,500 years. ASDT, we now have some DNA data on some Dorset, Sakak remains that suggest that they are related to Eskimo-Aleut and perhaps some Chukchi or material on the Chukokan side to 5,000 years. The Aleut tradition, we don't know what they were speaking. There's a disconnect between the genes and the languages here, but at least genetically they seem to be associated with the Aleut tradition 4,500 years ago. Kachemak, Eskimo-related. Talfili, Canadian Athabascans around 2,900 years ago. Pretty strong case, I think, there. And then I would definitely put this last one, that either Na-Dene or Athabascans or some subset of that group, I think, are probably associated at least with the Northern Archaea. The isomorphy is just too exact. And the 1,000-year time frame of that last change is way too recent. And on the Russian side, Tokarevo has been argued to be linked with Koryak, Ustamil with Yukagir, and Okhotsk with Nipki. And these are pushing back to around that 4,500, 4,000 year period. I think this is a useful place to start, to be thinking about some of these connections. Okay, we have long-term, stable cultural boundaries established by the Middle Holocene. There it is. In specific regions. Northern Archaic and Shield Archaic at the southeastern edge of the western Boreal Forest. This seems to be a little bit more kind of changing through time, but there does seem to be a long-term boundary there. Certainly the relationship between Plateau Pit House and Northern Archaic is extremely stable, and you don't see a lot of disconnects there. And then, of course, the boundary between Eskimo-Aleut related peoples and Northern Archaic it's been established, and you have these two traditions that don't seem to be sharing a lot of material culture, and they certainly don't share economies and basic life ways and structural poses. The sequences, ASTT, and we'll start on this side. So ASTT, Choris, Norton, Kipitak, and then later Northern Maritime tradition, a clear sequence with very few links in the interior. Shield Archaic to Woodland and then Central Subarctic, again, stable. and Northern Archaic to Athabascan, which is simply just mapped right on each other. I mean, there is no major difference around 1,000 years ago with where these guys are at. Absolutely. So these data suggest Na-Dene prehistory certainly extends beyond 1,000 years. I think arguably to 6,000. Beyond that, I'm not willing to make a statement one way or another. That's getting a little bit too far back into material culture that expands way beyond our neck of the woods. But at least 6,000, I think, is not unreasonable. So what avenues would I suggest? A couple of things for the Dene-Yenisian hypothesis. Ethnographically, well, we need to start with the recent past. We should forget necessarily about going back to the Ice Age. We need to start with those sequences that I just talked about, linking through the direct historical approach the most recent prehistoric phenomenon with the closely related ethnographic groups and contact times. I think we need to understand the relationship between the languages, between the life ways, and then the material cultural correlates we see at really firm, recent time frames. Recent groups have stronger links with ethnographically known groups. There's better organic preservation, allowing for better relationships of looking at cognates, material culture, more evidence for trading networks, which again gets into relationships of relatedness versus relationships of borrowing. And I think that's a key element to consider. Copper, obsidian, etc. Ultimately, it's more tractable archaeologically, and stronger relationships or stronger effects on language distributions can be seen in the recent past. And we also need to address things like the White River Ash. I mean, there's major sorts of events that are happening that could cause the more recent record and the ethnographic record that we know, the linguistic record that we know, it could have been majorly transformed by this event that happened only 1,000 years ago. So we need to, I think, develop some models to look at that. The second thing is I think we should focus on borrowed terminology. We shouldn't focus only on trying to identify cognates in material culture between languages we suspect are similar, but we should go and look at multilateral comparisons for all of the languages, because the relationship of copper, whether they're borrowed or cognates within these different groups, this has some meaning. We can get directionality, we can get timing, and we know these guys have these languages. The quote that I have from Klabistan, Yupik and Samoyedic speakers share the same word for copper, but they have different words for iron. The end of that contact between the two must have occurred around 2,000 years ago. These are incredibly important, robust links. Whether or not the languages are related or not, how are these material cultural correlates moving and being borrowed between these different families? And it should include all, Salishan, Penutian, it should include, Chukchi, Kamchatkan, it should include Yukagir, all of the languages that are in our area. Ultimately, this allows us to build a stronger chronological anchor points for certain population movements, building a skeleton of expectations for contact, migration, and diffusion. And this includes amalgamation. We should consider that too. There's certainly evidence with Aleut that language and genes are not operating in the same way. And we shouldn't expect that should be the case everywhere. The third suggestion is we should consider dynamics in language and population. So we're dealing with small population sizes, co-residing bands, multi-band groups. How do they aggregate? When do they aggregate? How are they relating to mobility on the environment? The boreal forest in North America, the taiga of Asia, forest upon foragers, very, very high mobility. And this is going to, and low population sizes, this is going to have some effects in the genetics, it's going to have effects in the languages. There's a lot of planning, a lot of scheduling in terms of how to deal with this. And Jack Ives and others have talked about mechanisms, social mechanisms for promoting social cohesion, for minimizing risk. We should be looking at these and in terms of the languages, but also in terms of the material culture. These are high stress environments. Climate changes will have big impacts. And that's the other thing to consider, that we should be trying to track these major climatic events and changes in vegetation. Bison were here until 1,000 years ago or so. Bison is not just an ice age animal, and so that the extinction a few hundreds of years or 1,000 years ago is a really important thing we should consider across the board, because these marginal environments are so sensitive towards tipping one way or another. We all know this, but it bears reiterating: Indo-European is not a good model. We're dealing with non-agricultural systems. We're not dealing with writing. Demically, very different processes likely operating. So we should be thinking about modeling, founders' effects. We should be modeling ideas of lineage extinctions. If you had a greater range of variability at a certain time, we have less now. There are ways to get at that. Agent-based modeling would be one of those. And the last issue is we should be considering the interior broadly, in terms of like the area of the Yukon era and now, or in the recent past, and the Yeniseian, as a very different kind of a landscape, and Na-Dene in the interior, than this coastal thing. Very different sorts of ecological zones are operating. Humans responded in very different ways, different structural poses within these areas. In the interior, we're dealing with high mobility, very conservative technologies. We've got microblades that last a long time in Northeast Asia as well. So highly mobile, conservative folks, and innovations take time. In the coastal areas, we're dealing with more rapid change, much more complex. And things like toggling harpoon heads, when they show up, boom, they're accepted throughout the region, almost instantaneously. So we've got different vectors, I guess, of material culture change, and I expect very different potential patterns on language distributions and language connections. And how are we doing on time? 5 minutes? I have 5 minutes.
Well, yeah,
oh,
if you want questions.
Okay. Well, I'll close with this, and then I wanted to open up for questions. I really wanted to just present a little bit of what we've done recently, but this is the dialogue that needs to happen now between the geneticists, the linguists, and the archaeologists. I do want to end with one point, and that's that we have a lot of data for this region. So Lena, the Aldon, the Lake Baikal region. Ed mentioned all the great work that is being done by Weber and his colleagues down there, and I think all of us tied in on that immediately, that the Katoi looks so different. One thing that I didn't mention is that once the Katoi is gone from that area, they're replaced by people that are very much Altaic, and linked with the populations that are there now. And that's always been the problem is, wow, this Katoi look quite distinct. Genetically, they're quite distinct. And the later peoples are essentially the peoples that are there now. That level of continuity is important to consider. But what we really need is this region. We have very, very little information about the lower Yenisei, the lower O, the Taimyr Peninsula, into the Kolyma. We have quite a bit of data on the upper Kolyma here, but very little information here. So there's big, huge stretches that I think are going to change our ideas about the archaeology. And ultimately, I do think, I don't know, I guess we can maybe think about homelands, but this record is essentially absent. We just don't have that information. So I would encourage, well, Siberian archaeologists among us that we need to be doing more work there. Yeah, I think that's it. So I did want to have time for questions, so that's it for the formal presentation.
Yeah, let's take questions. We have a break following 5 minutes or so.
Oh, one last thing, I forgot to put this slide up. So Mike Fortescue just recently did a chapter where out to sea equals towards the fire, macrocosm relationship of languages. I think this is kind of innovative sorts of research. It's not looking necessarily at relatedness cognate-wise, but simply ideology, where into the fire is like out to sea, that you've got these connections, and he's linking it with house forms. So areas of temporary tent-like dwellings that essentially link a lot of the interior on both sides with and these are typically semi-subterranean houses with tunnels, as opposed to on the coast, Nivki, some of the Evyen, and some of the areas in the northwest coast that are actually you have ladders that go into the house from the top. And he's making some arguments about potential linkages, but see, it's the same thing that I was just discussing, that you've got very different sorts of patterns along the North Pacific Rim than you have in the interior. I will note that there are some incorrect things here, like there actually are semi-subterranean with tunnel houses at Ushki. That's essentially what the Ushki houses are. So it's not perfect, but I encourage us to be thinking along these lines. I think we can really develop some good synergistic multidisciplinary arguments.
So this is our first brief question period. Let's take
and
questions
I have maps
in the room.
Yeah.
Ed.
The Aldon River, it almost goes to the Yenisei watershed when it comes close to the Lake Baikal. Did they find semi-subterranean dwellings along that area? You said that the archaeology there is pretty well known.
In the older record, I'm primarily thinking of the work that Machonov has done. Maybe they can answer. I don't think they did, but they don't have huge numbers of sites with houses preserved. It's just a very rare thing to find in any event. Yeah.
Fortescue talks about the Amur River region being a place that seems to have that technology of house building.
Yeah, there's more data there in the Amur region for sure.
It's pretty linguistically and archaeologically distinct from.
Yeah. Yeah.
My presentation this afternoon will return to this whole issue. It will fit in with what I say perception.
Yeah, I did have one actually before, I forgot I had a note here. I did just a check on some of the recent genetic data. Kashani et al. 2012, it just came out in AJPA. They were looking at mitochondrial haplogroup C4C, which is linked specifically with X2A, which we talked about is only found in Algonquins primarily, basically at the end of the ice-free corridor. This links in directly with it, plus you mentioned the issue of X2 being found in Europe, or some connection. This is only found in Asia. So this basically demonstrates that there is no Salishan connection, there is no European connection. These things are isomorphic. So I'm glad that came out, just the last one. So,
Larry?
Yeah, Ben, we have a question from an online participant. Roy Mitchell asks when you're expecting to have the DNA results from the child at Hassan.
It's ongoing, that's all I can say. It's tough. The remains are cremated. DNA doesn't preserve well under most circumstances, and certainly burning doesn't help. But we have the best people in the world that are on it at the University of Utah, the Ancient DNA Laboratory, Dennis O'Rourke and his team. I know the DNA was there, it was extracted, but it needs to be amplified, so they're working on mechanisms to amplify it. So I'm hoping that we know soon, but yeah, no comment, I guess, beyond that.
Robert?
Hey, Ben.
Yeah.
I went to the Native Language Conference in Whitehorse last June,
Mhm.
and there was professors from the Canada side area. And it was put up by the first people.
Mhm.
And the question came up about the word Athabascan.
Mhm.
The professor said that word didn't mean anything. It came from some people just saying people from over there. Have you ever heard about that?
Oh yeah. My understanding, and Jim,
Right, it's an
correct me if I'm-
Algonquian
It's an
word.
Algonquian term for, I think, enemy? Is
The
there-
Cree, it's Cree for how they called some people on their northern border. So,
Okay.
yeah, Dene, or Dene is
Dene.
your word.
Yeah.
My other question is, I know Canada uses the K in their word for Athabascan, but here in the interior we stick to C.
Yeah.
We want to keep that in our area as the C word. And then also, back in the 50s, I read about the Native people of America in the book Encyclopedia book that were published in the 50s. And they said we migrated from Southeast Asia.
Hmm.
So that would tie us into the Asian people as well.
I think, right, and I guess, I don't know if you guys are going next, or maybe Dave's going next, but the genetic data so far is pretty consistent that Northeast Asia seems to be the closest link, which makes sense. That you're in terms of Southeast Asia or Northeast Asia, it's definitely closer. The genetic links are there, certainly the archaeological links are there. And I tell my students all the time, the archaeology of Alaska looks more Asian than it does North American, and so this really connects us closely.
That's the way I read the book.
Yeah.
And then also, I've been saying this to my brothers and sisters in Lower 48, and they say we came the other way, so there's a conflict of interest there.
Mhm. Yeah, I think the connection, as Ed mentioned, the connection between these different lines of data, any one data set probably wouldn't be as strong. When you put them all together, it can create stronger sorts of arguments. And I think we're heading that direction. There was another article that was just published looking at the number of founders and then the timing, and it is matching closer the archaeological data, which is more like the 15,000 year range for the initial peopling. So I think we're getting, early on, a lot of the early genetic work, 50,000, 30,000 there, all sorts of numbers were being played out, but we talked about the sampling issue. And then knowing the rates of mutation, the rates of change, I think we're getting a better and better handle. The more samples we have, the more ancient samples we have, we're getting a better handle, and it seems to be coalescing into a late Pleistocene, system.
Well, I'm very interested in helping the education system understand our way of knowing, and I'm pushing for that. So our students should be able to learn the history and archaeology, all that about our people that is being studied.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I really want to, go back to this slide, because you're absolutely right. I agree with you wholeheartedly. There's a rich ethnographic data set, and not just linguistic, but just, how people operated, how they dealt with each other. The things that we can't get from the archaeological record easily, and there's no reason why we can't integrate this strong inference sort of approach into archaeology. And that's kind of been my push for the last several years now, is to try to learn more about the ancient past with a well-known system, which is the Athabascan life way. Absolutely.